Welcome to Singapore Property Talk Law, everybody. I'm Damien. Today, we're going to dive deep into a situation involving Yang Kee Logistics and UOB Bank.
Oh, this should be interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, actually. So our main sources today are going to be a statutory declaration that was given by the company's former CEO and some recent news reports.
Gotcha.
With me today to help unpack all of this, we've got Serene.
Hi, everyone. I'm Serene.
So, Serene, what are we hoping to get out of this deep dive?
Well, I think the goal today is for everyone listening to really try to understand what exactly happened and what these pretty serious allegations are that have come up about the relationship between Yang Kee Logistics, or YKL, and United Overseas Bank, UOB. We'll be calling that a lot, probably. And then also what it all might mean, kind of looking forward. We've got this super detailed statement from Mr. Ko Keen Chan, who is the CEO of YKL, and it outlines a whole bunch of different events and some honestly really worrying allegations against UOB. And then to get the other side, we've also got UOB's official response to everything and a statement from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. To set the stage a bit, let's quickly go over Yang Kee Logistics. So this was a family-owned logistics company. They were founded way back in 1990, and they actually grew quite a bit throughout the region over the years. We should also mention a few other companies that are kind of connected to all this. There's Yang Kee Ltd. That was the family's main holding company, and it held a majority stake in YKL. Then you've got Yang Kee Holdings, or YKH. They were basically the group's property arm.
I see.
And then there's Yang Kee Logistics, Singapore Ltd. or YKLS, and that handled the day-to-day operations. A really important property in this whole thing was their warehouse at 8 Jurong Pier Road. It was a big asset for them, and they were actually planning on using it as part of a future plan to go public involving master leases.
Okay, so financially, UOB had a pretty big mortgage on that warehouse at 8 Jurong Pier Road, like $130 million.
Wow.
And YKL, they had mortgages with DBS and CIMB too, but for some of their other properties.
Right, so it's not like they were completely tied to UOB.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is going to be important later on when we talk about refinancing. It's good to keep that in mind.
For sure, that's a good point. Okay, so things really start moving in 2015. That's when it seems like UOB introduced YKL to Logos, a logistics real estate company. And this kind of kicked off a whole chain of suggested deals. And it's these deals that are really at the heart of what we're going to be looking at today. So let's break down these events from 2015. This is where the alleged problems start to appear.
Okay, so in 2015, Logos said they were interested in maybe investing in Yang Kee's properties. But because of YKL's loan terms with UOB, any sale of shares to Logos would need UOB to sign off on it. And one of the first allegations here is pretty interesting, I think. Mr. Ko says that UOB hinted that if they were the ones advising YKL in these talks with Logos, it would make it easier to get internal approval within UOB for the sale of the shares.
Oh, so it's like they were saying, hey, work with us as advisors and we'll make it easier for you to get the deal approved.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the first deals they talked about was a sale and leaseback of that property at 8 Jurong Pier Road. But Ken Ko, he wasn't having it. He said no. He pointed out that they had just finished building the property and YKL had a really long lease on it. So selling it off right away just didn't make sense strategically.
That makes sense.
Right. It shows he was a little hesitant to just give up a really important asset.
Yeah.
So then Logos came back with a different idea. This time they suggested a much higher rental rate for that same property, something like $1.80 per square foot. And YKL at the time was paying $1 in.
That's a big jump.
Huge jump. And naturally, Ken Ko was a bit concerned, right? Was this new rate even reasonable, and what kind of risk would it bring for YKL's profits?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a valid concern.
Totally. So this is where things get a little interesting. Mr. Ko claims that Logos and Rosalind from UOB tried to convince him separately that the high rental rate wasn't actually a problem.
Oh, how'd they explain that?
Well, they said that because YKL would still own 80% of YKH, that's the property part of the business, any loss from that higher rent would basically be balanced out when the rental income was given back to the shareholders, including YKL and Logos. But Ken Ko was still really skeptical about this, especially about how KPMG, who was Logos's auditor, would ever approve this during their due diligence.
Yeah, that does seem a little too good to be true, maybe.
Totally. And the pressure from UOB didn't stop there. Mr. Koh claims that UOB really pushed him to agree to this whole setup. He says that UOB told him they would be very disappointed if the deal fell through. And get this, he says they even hinted that there might be consequences for YKL's relationship with UOB if he didn't play ball and support the deal.
Oh, wow, that sounds like some serious pressure.
Right. And remember, UOB held that huge $130 million mortgage on their main property, and it would be really hard for YKL to find another bank to refinance that amount quickly. So Kenko felt like he had no choice but to say yes, even though he wasn't really happy about it. He was worried UOB would basically turn against them.
That makes sense in that situation.
So that's kind of the scene in 2015. What happens next in 2016?
So then, in 2016, we have an important introduction. Rosalind Lee, she was YTL's relationship manager at UOB. She introduced Ken Koh to Edmund Leong. Mr. Leong had just become the new head of UOB's investment banking division. He'd come over from Macquarie Bank in Hong Kong, actually. And Ken Koh says that Rosalind specifically asked him to support Edmund in his new role.
So this is a new player entering the scene.
Yes, a key player, actually.
And this is where we have another allegation. Ken Koh claims that he was told that if he didn't support Edmund, it could put YKL's entire banking relationship with UOB at risk.
Oh, wow.
And that included refinancing that mortgage on 8 Jurong Pier Road that we talked about earlier. So the pressure to side with UOB was getting more intense.
Definitely. And then, just after that, Edmund Leong suggested a pretty big deal. He proposed that United Orient Capital, UOC, should invest US $20 million in YKL through something called convertible bonds.
Convertible bonds? What are those?
So it's basically a type of bond that could be changed into shares of the company later on.
I see.
Now, importantly, UOC was technically a joint venture, like 50-50, with a Japanese company called Oryx. But Mr. Koh's statement says that UOB was really calling the shots at UOC because they controlled the board and the investment committee, and even had the deciding vote. So even though UOC was technically a separate entity, Mr. Koh says that it was basically an extension of UOB.
That's interesting. So even though it looked like a separate investment, it was really UOB pulling the strings.
Exactly. And it wasn't just any ordinary bond either. The terms were, well, let's just say they weren't great. We're talking about a 27% return for the investor.
That's a lot.
Right. And UOC could decide when to convert those bonds into shares whenever they wanted. YKL didn't have any say in it. This could potentially cost YKL a ton of money and mean they lose control of their company.
That's risky.
Very risky. And of course, Ken Koh had some serious concerns. He says that YKL wasn't making that much profit at the time, only around $500,000 per year. The interest on that US $20 million bond at 27% would be like US $4 million per year, which is way more than their yearly profit.
Wow.
So naturally, he was hesitant to sign.
I can see why.
For sure. So Mr. Koh says he went back to Rosalind Lee for advice. She told him to just go ahead and sign the bond agreement. She said that Edmund Leong was a really important person at UOB, and he was the one who had brought Edmund over from Macquarie. She was basically saying that Edmund was the second most powerful person at UOB, just under the CEO, Wee Chiang. And she kept emphasizing how UOB was really focused on growing their investment banking business. She basically said if YKL wanted to stay on good terms with UOB, especially with that $130 million mortgage coming up for renewal, then Ken Koh should just agree to the bonds.
It sounds like they were trying to link the bond investment with refinancing the mortgage, like it was all part of one big package.
Yeah, exactly. So then Ken Koh went to talk to Edmund Leong directly to discuss extending the mortgage loan. Edmund told him if he signed the convertible bond agreement, then he would help extend the loan. He even suggested making the mortgage due at the same time the bonds matured, with one big payment in 2021. So basically, YKL would have to pay back both the US $20 million bond and the $130 million mortgage all at once in 2021.
Yikes, talk about pressure. That's a lot of money to come up with all at the same time.
I know, right? So Ken Koh actually questioned this whole setup. He pointed out that this short-term mortgage structure was pretty unusual for a property that was supposed to be held long-term, especially under the rules of JTC.
Right, so what did Edmund say to that?
Well, Ken Koh says that Edmund just brushed off his concerns. He said he was under a lot of pressure to get results in his new role at UOB, and that the bond deal and the mortgage extension were a package deal. They had to go together. He also told Ken Koh that by 2021 he would be in a stronger position at UOB, and with the help of Frederick Chin, he would then refinance the bonds on better terms, more like a mortgage. So he was saying the high interest on the bonds would be a temporary thing.
A lot of promises being thrown around.
Right, a lot of don't worry, it'll all work out later kind of talk. And it's interesting, Ken Koh also talks about how his father reacted to all of this.
Oh.
Yeah, he said that when he first told his father about the bond proposal, his father was totally shocked by how high the interest rates were. I mean, his father was the one who built the relationship with UOB over the years, and he was really against the idea.
I bet.
But Kenko had to explain the situation. He told his father that if they didn't take the bond deal, UOB might end their mortgage on that H-Rong Pier Road property.
That's a tough spot.
I know. And it was only because of that threat that his father finally agreed, very reluctantly, to go along with it. It shows just how dependent the family was on UOB.
Wow. Okay, so we're in 2017 now. The bond agreement is done. What happens next?
Okay, so in 2017, the bond deal goes through, and YKL had to pay UOB's investment banking division $700,000 in fees for setting up the whole thing.
That's a lot of fees.
It is. And on top of that, the bond agreement said that UOC got to appoint someone to YKL's board of directors, and they chose Mr. Yo Yap.
Right.
And get this, anytime YKL wanted to merge with another company, buy another company, or raise more money, they had to get UOC's approval.
So UOC now had a lot of control over YKL.
Pretty much. And it seems like they wasted no time in using the money from these bonds.
Oh, what did they do?
Well, Edmund Leong told Ken Ko that the best way to use the bond money was to buy other logistics companies, specifically outside of Singapore. Yeah, the idea was that this would help YKL make money from different places, not just Singapore, and make them look better for when UOB eventually helped them go public through an IPO. So they started looking at Australia for potential companies to buy.
Okay.
And they ended up recommending a company called Axima, an Australian company. They bought Axima for $32 million, using money from the UAC bonds and also from selling a 20% stake in YKH to Logos.
So they're expanding into Australia?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and both UOB and YKL hired BDA to do the due diligence for this deal.
So the plan for the IPO was moving along, funded by those bonds?
Exactly.
Makes sense. So what about Flyway in New Zealand? How did they get involved?
So in early 2018, around the same time they were finalizing the Axima deal, Yo Yap was approached by Credit Suisse Australia. They were talking about selling a publicly listed New Zealand logistics company called Flyway. Mr. Yap mentioned this to Ken Ko, and they both flew over to New Zealand to take a look at the company. Then, UOB advised that buying Flyway would be a good strategic move because it would fit well with their recent Axima acquisition in Australia. They said there would be some good business synergies, and it could even create the biggest logistics company in Singapore, with annual revenue of something like $350 million.
Wow, that sounds pretty impressive.
Right. It was all looking really good for growth.
But then the problem of financing this second acquisition popped up.
Yeah, that's right. Ken Ko was already a bit worried because they had borrowed a lot of money for the Axima deal, and they didn't really have enough cash on hand to buy Flyway.
Makes sense.
And that's when Yo Yap introduced him to Simon Eng from China Construction Bank International, CCBI. They'd worked together before, and CCBI had just started a new team in Singapore that specialized in a certain kind of financing. They proposed that YKL could use bonds again, like they did with UOC, to raise the money for Flyway. But Ken Ko was worried about taking on even more debt.
Yeah, I can see why. So how did they address that?
So Wee Yap told Edmund Leong about these concerns, and they talked about it for a few weeks. Then Edmund Leong made a big promise. He said that if YKL bought Flyway for no more than $52 million and used CCBI bonds to pay for it, then the combined logistics company could be valued at $320 million.
He just threw out a big number like that.
Yeah, basically. Ken Ko asked why they couldn't just get the money from UOC since they had already invested through the bonds. Evan said UOC didn't have any more money to invest for the time being. But he did say that UOC would manage the CCBI investment, and that since Wee Yap and Simon Eng knew each other, it would all go smoothly.
Okay. So the focus was on this big potential valuation.
Right. But there was something else, too. As an extra incentive, Edmund Leong also promised to refinance the H-Rong Pier Road mortgage at a lower interest rate, like a spread of 100 basis points lower, on top of that big valuation they were promising. He even met with Ken Ko and Simon Eng from CCBI together to really try and push for the deal.
He's pulling out all the stops.
He was. So in the end, Ken Ko agreed, but only on the condition that the YKL board approved it. And remember, UOB's representative Yo Yap was on that board.
Right.
So CCBI got their lawyers, Wang P, involved, and then they invested US $20 million, and Simon Eng also joined YKL's board of directors. And then in January 2018, the Flyway acquisition was done.
Wow, so they're moving fast.
They are. So with these two new companies now part of YKL, they turned their attention to going public, that IPO.
Right, so what happened next?
Okay, so after Flyway and Axima were integrated into YKL's reporting, the management team, led by the CFO Cheng Ter Chang, put together presentations from 3 possible advisors for the IPO: Rothschild, Nomura, and UOB.
So they had options.
They did. And just as Edmund Leong had promised, UOB's presentation included that $320 million valuation for the whole company. In the end, the board, including Ken Ko and other independent directors, chose UOB to be their IPO advisor, and they all signed an agreement.
It seems like everything was going according to plan.
It did, for a while. But then that whole thing with refinancing the 8 Pier Road mortgage came up again.
Oh, right. So what happened there?
So Ken Ko followed up with Edmund Leong about his promise to return the mortgage. This was around 6 months after Edmund had made that promise, remember?
Right, as part of the deal to get CCBI on board.
Exactly. But this time, Edmund was being evasive. He said that UOB was a big company, and there were procedures and different departments involved. Ken Ko started to feel like Edmund was either not able to or not willing to keep his promise.
That's not a good sign.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's at this point that his trust in UOB starts to fade.
Understandably. Did UOB do anything positive around this time?
Yeah, actually. As part of that agreement to be the advisor for the YKLS IPO, UOB gave YKL a bridging loan of $5 million in December of 2018.
Okay, a small gesture of goodwill, maybe.
Perhaps. But soon after that, Ken Ko brought up the mortgage refinancing again with Rosalind Lee and her team, Yap Kee-sin, and Chua Shang-kun. He reminded them that it was Edmund's promise to refinance that convinced him to go with the CCBI bonds and buy Flyway.
He was trying to hold them to their word.
Yeah, but according to Mr. Ko, they just passed the buck. They said it was Edmund who made the promise, not them, and that they all reported to different people at UOB, even though they were all ultimately under Frederick Chin.
That's a bit of a bureaucratic runaround, isn't it?
It is. And Ken Ko pushed back, saying that when he does business with anyone from UOB, he sees it as a promise from UOB itself, especially if the promise comes from a department head.
That makes sense. So what was the solution then?
So they said that to get around UOB's internal rules, YKL should hire a consultant to write a report for UOB's management. This report would explain why changing the terms of the loan was necessary.
Okay, and who did they suggest?
Well, when Ken Ko asked for recommendations, they really pushed for RSM Chio Lim. Yeah. Chua Shang-kun even told him on a call that if RSM's report said the loan needed to be retermed, it would be really easy for her to get it approved by the credit department.
So RSM enters the story.
Exactly. And around the same time, Ken Ko met some people from Chinese state-owned enterprises.
Oh, SOEs. How did that happen?
It was in January 2019 when YKL's China Special Projects Director, Adrian Su, introduced Ken Ko to Shenzhen International, or SZI. SZI is a big company listed in Hong Kong with headquarters in Shenzhen. They own tons of warehouses, hotels, and ports. And Kenneth Kai, the CFO of SCI, said he was very interested in working with YKL to buy warehouses outside of China for the first time. It was part of that whole Belt and Road initiative from the Chinese government. And then Mr. Kai also introduced Ken Ko to Guangdong Province Navigation Group, or GDPS, another SOE based in Guangdong with similar assets. So for the next year or so, Ken Ko had multiple meetings with people from both SCI and GDPS.
Interesting. So while all this was happening with the UOB mortgage and the potential IPO, they also had these Chinese investors who might be interested.
Yeah, that's right. They had options.
Makes sense. And what about UOB? Didn't they ask for something unusual regarding Ken Ko's personal property?
Yeah, so this is another interesting part. Chua Chang-kun told Ken Ko that for UOB to refinance the 8 Pier Road mortgage, he would also have to put up his own personal property as collateral. It was his place at 25 Tui Chien View. She said it was a safe thing to do because the mortgage would cover it, but still, for UOB to ask him to put up his own property was a pretty big deal.
Wow. That's a lot of personal risk.
Right. It shows how much UOB was asking of him.
For sure. Okay, so moving on to March 2019, Geodis shows interest in buying YKLS. How did that come about?
Right, so after UOB became the advisor for the Yankee IPO, Edmund Leong went to Ken Ko and told him that Logos had approached him. They said that Geodis, a big French logistics company and one of their clients, wanted to buy YKLS and had asked Logos to connect them with the banker in charge of YKLS's IPO.
Interesting. And Logos and Geodis, they had a history of working together in different countries.
Yeah, they did. So Edmund asked Ken Ko if he would meet Onno Boots, the president and CEO for Geodis in the Asia-Pacific region, and Ken Ko said yes. They met at YKL's office at 8 Pier Road.
Okay, so now there's another potential buyer for part of the YKL business.
Exactly.
And did Ken Ko tell Edmund about the Chinese investors too?
Yeah, he did. He saw them as potential investors or partners for YKL,
Yeah.
and he wanted UOB to look at all the options as their advisor. Right.
Right, of course. Okay, so in April 2019, RSM's role becomes more official. Tell me about that.
Okay, so Chua Sheng-kun gave YKL's CFO, Cheng Cheng, the contact details for Tae Woon Tech from RSM.
Okay.
So Mr. Tae met with Ken Ko and Mr. Cheng, and Ken Ko actually recognized him from some seminars they had both attended in the past.
Small world.
Right. So Mr. Tae explained that his boss, Chio Kien Huat, was close with some of the top people at UOB, people like Ko Cheng Chua, the head of credit, and Tan Buk Chai, the head of group special asset management. He said they often worked together to change the terms of loans. Then, RSM sent over an agreement with their fees, but Ken Ko thought the fees were really high.
What did Mr. Tae say about that?
Mr. Tae said his services would save Yankee money in the long run because they'd get a better deal on the mortgage reterming, which would improve their cash flow. So Ken Ko signed the agreement, hoping that RSM's connections would help them finally refinance the mortgage.
Makes sense. But RSM's role didn't just stop there, right?
Right. Mr. Tae later suggested that YKL should also hire RSM to look at their whole capital structure and come up with exit strategies for both the property and logistics businesses.
So now they'd be working on a much bigger scale.
Yeah, exactly. Ken Ko even pointed out that they already had UOB working as their IPO advisor. But Mr. Tae said this RSM thing would be on a success basis. So basically, if no deal happened, they wouldn't charge anything. He also said that RSM knew some Chinese investors who might be interested in Yankee. So Ken Ko, liking the success basis idea and the possibility of more options, agreed to give RSM this bigger role.
Okay.
But there were some delays, so they didn't actually sign the agreement for this new role until November 2019.
So now YKL had both UOB and RSM working on different parts of their business strategy.
Yep, that's right. And then, in June 2019, Logos made a move to try to buy the rest of YKH, the property business.
Ah, okay. So what happened?
Well, Stephen Hawkins and Park Sung from Logos, they went with Edmund Leong from UOB to see Ken Ko. They proposed buying the remaining 80% of YKH. But Ken Ko wasn't interested in selling more at that point. He wanted to focus on making those new acquisitions work and getting ready for the YKLS IPO, the one UOB was supposed to help with.
Right.
But UOB and Logos, they didn't give up. They told Ken Ko that Logos was about to merge with ARA Asset Management and that they wanted to have more properties under their control to make the merger look more attractive.
Interesting. So it was all about making that merger look good.
Yeah, it seems so. And get this, Ken Ko later found out from public announcements that UOB was actually the financial advisor for ESR when they bought ARA Logos.
Oh, wow. That's a bit of a conflict of interest, isn't it? Definitely seems like it. And Edmund Leong also explained that because YKL shares in YKH were used as collateral for the UOC bond deal, they would have to get approval from both the UOC and CCBI boards for the sale.
So UOB's involvement is getting even deeper.
Exactly.
So even though Ken Ko didn't really want to sell any more of YKH, did they end up selling a bit more to Logos anyway?
Yeah, they did. YKL needed some cash quickly, so they agreed to sell another 29% of YKH to Logos for $60 million. But Ken Ko made it very clear to UOB and Logos that he wasn't going to sell the remaining 51%. He was going to hold on to that until the YKLS IPO was done.
I see.
And the deal was done in two parts. UOC and CCBI had to give their approval for the sale because, remember, they had a claim on YKL's shares in YKH as the bondholders.
Right. Makes sense. So they got some quick cash, but it also meant they had less control over their property company.
Exactly. Now, YKH was actually losing money because of all those mortgage payments they had to make.
Right.
So RSM stepped in to try and renegotiate with UOB.
Yeah, so YKH was paying $720,000 every month to UOB for the mortgage on the H. Rong Pier Road property. This was actually causing them to lose money every month.
Ouch.
Yeah, it wasn't good. So RSN set up a meeting between the YKL team and UOB, specifically with Tan Buk Chai. They wanted to try to get better terms on the mortgage. And the meeting apparently went well. Mr. Tan acknowledged that Yankee had been really good to UOB, especially their investment banking division.
He was probably thinking about those fees.
Right. So they agreed to lower the monthly payment to $370,000, down from $720,000. But in exchange, YKL had to pay down their MML line. It was probably some kind of mortgage management loan.
Gotcha. So that would at least give YKH some breathing room.
It did, for a while.
Yeah.
Then later in July 2019, there was this trip to China with Edmund from UOB, Huang Zongda from CCBI, and Ken Ko.
Interesting. Why did they go to China?
They went to Shenzhen to meet with SCI and GDPS, those Chinese state-owned companies, to talk about them possibly investing in Yankee. They got a tour of the SOE's offices and saw a company presentation. It showed that those Chinese companies were seriously considering a deal.
So things were progressing on that front.
Yeah, definitely. And then in October 2019, Geodis finally gave UOB Investment Banking an official offer for YKLS. They offered $160 million.
Not bad. Any conditions?
Oh yeah, there were a bunch of conditions, and Ken Ko thought some of them would be really hard to meet. Edmund and his team at UOB suggested that YKL should give Geodis exclusive rights to do their due diligence.
So no one else could make an offer.
Yeah, that's what exclusivity means.
Mm.
But Ken Ko didn't want to do that. He said those conditions were a problem, and giving Geodis exclusive rights would mean they couldn't talk to the Chinese companies anymore. He said it would waste a lot of time.
So what did he say they should do?
Well, he said he'd be open to working with Geodis, but not exclusively. He wanted to be able to keep talking to other potential investors. And he also reminded Edmund that they needed approval from JTC for any changes in who owned YKH and YKLS, and that SEI and GDPS were interested in buying the whole group, including the bonds and logo share of YKH. But it seems like at this point, Edmund wasn't that interested in those Chinese companies anymore. He even hinted that Logos might not want to sell their part of YKH because of that merger they were doing with ARA.
Interesting. It sounds like their interests were starting to diverge.
Yeah, so Ken Ko reminded him that YKL had the option to buy out Logos if they needed to, according to their shareholder agreement. It seems like Ken Ko wanted to keep all options open, but UOB was pushing for the Geodis deal.
Gotcha. And then in November 2019, there's that big allegation of a banking secrecy breach. What happened there?
Right, so Tae Woon Tech from RSM went to see Ken Ko and told him that he knew about Geodis' $160 million offer.
Wait, how did he know that? That was confidential.
Exactly. So Ken Ko asked him how he knew, and Mr. Tae said that Edmund Leong had told Ko Cheng Chua at UOB, who had then told RSM senior partner Chio Kian Huat over dinner the night before.
So Edmund had been gossiping.
Essentially. Mr. Chio is Mr. Tae's boss, and he told Mr. Tae to go talk to Ken Ko about it.
I see.
Ken Ko was really surprised, to say the least. Mr. Tae even knew about the specific conditions in Geodis' offer, like needing certain bank balances to stay the same. At first, Ken Ko denied that there was even an offer, but when he realized Mr. Tae knew so much, he admitted it. But he stressed that there were lots of conditions and that Geodis wanted exclusive rights. He also told Mr. Tae about the offer from the Chinese companies for the whole group, saying that it was important to talk to them.
Okay.
So then, Mr. Tae was pretty blunt. He told Ken Ko that Logos had told Edmund privately that they didn't want to sell their part of YKH at that time because of the merger with ARA. Apparently, the whole reason ARA was buying Logos was because of all the warehouses they owned, including Yankees. Mr. Tae also pointed out that ARA's CEO, John Lim, was good friends with UOB's CEO, Wee Ichiam, unlike the Chinese companies. And he said he would try to convince UOB to go with the offer from the Chinese companies.
Okay. So it was all about who you know.
Right. And around the same time, ARA made a move that kind of showed they were serious about buying Logos. They announced that they were selling their stake in Cash Logistics Trust to Logos. It was like a first step towards that merger.
Right. Makes sense. And then in December 2019, RSM gets into more hot water by sharing confidential info with other investors.
Yeah, so Phillips Capital had invested in YKLS through those convertible bonds.
Okay.
And Patrick Yang from Phillips Capital told Ken Ko that he knew about Geodis' offer.
Wait, how did he know that?
He said Tae Woon Tech from RSM had told him.
Wow, so much for confidentiality.
Right. Mr. Yang said that as an investor, they had a right to know what was going on. So Ken Ko gave them the Geodis term sheet, but he was really mad at Mr. Tae for sharing that info without his permission.
Understandably, it seems like Mr. Tae was trying to pressure him to go with Geodis.
That's what it looks like. And of course, this whole thing made Ken Ko trust RSM even less.
Rightfully so. So we're in 2020 now. Does Ken Ko confront Mr. Tae about this?
He does. He confronted Mr. Tae, who apologized and promised to finish that UOB report to make things right. But